We tend to think of learning as something that we do. But what if what we already know or believe or think has already happened to us and without us even knowing, simply because two events happen together, that is by association. Welcome to The Art of Therapy, Season 3, Episode 7.
It's good to be back here with you, just in our studio, and just really exploring the world of psychotherapy and just how it developed.
Yes, it's quite remarkable.
No. Just to recap a bit on our last episode. So in our last episode, we really explored attachment theory and really understanding how our early relationship with our caregivers, how that shapes our inner self, how we trust, how we have emotional regulation. And through repeated interactions with our primary caregivers, that there's different attachment styles that can be established. And through different attachment styles, that is how we learn how to manage the stress.
Very much beautifully expressed. What I think is so remarkable is that those early interactions form something of a blueprint that shape the way we interact and the way we form attachments even later in life, and how those really are all ways of self-regulating and emotional regulation. And anything that's been learnt, there can be corrective emotional experience and new ways of interacting, new ways of relating learnt that can be equally effective and helpful in managing emotions and self-regulation. So, it's such a hopeful model and a contribution to psychotherapy.
It really is. It creates so much understanding, and there's so much power in that, or empowerment in that. Where it is, just because it's one way, doesn't mean it has to stay that way. It can change as well where it's needed.
Yes, very much.
So, and for today, we really started to look at relationships, but then the world of psychotherapy then changed, and it started to have a look at behavior, and which means what we observe, how we can have change in the present, in the here and now. So maybe our focus can move to behavior therapy and understanding a bit of behavior therapy now.
Yeah, now we really step up, because there's a step change with behaviorism and behavior therapy. What's really interesting is that if we just go and just again consider attachment theory, part of the development there was focusing on actual interactions, actual behavior, actual relating. And that was a really exciting development. But of course, as one focuses and sees the value of looking at and studying interaction, actual interaction, behavior, well, then the next move is to really almost purely and very closely focus on behavior and what does that tell us and what can we learn from it. And so that's the exciting development in behavior therapy, really starting to focus and hone in on behavior. But the key development here with behavior therapy is, for the first time in psychotherapy and in the history of psychotherapy, beginning to recognize that behavior itself can be the problem. Behavior itself is what can be addressed. And it's not necessarily always the case of having to address a wound from the past, that we can actually focus on behavior. And that's quite something.
It really is. It makes therapy so tangible.
Yes, it does. And that's really the massive contribution here with behavior therapy, because the moment behavior therapy begins to focus on behavior, and these are with us today, it's 120 years plus, and these developments of thinking is really present in major therapeutic applications today. And the focus on behavior makes it really measurable. It's short-term, it's scientific, and it addresses change in a very systematic way. And just this idea that we can, if we just focus on behavior, that we can learn new behaviors, that we can learn new kinds of connections, associations, that we can actually very rapidly make changes in our mood, emotions, our behavior. It's remarkably empowering when one just begins to understand behavior and some of the laws of behavior, but the laws of learning. And that is behavior therapy.
It's so much empowerment in that, and it makes it in the here and now and observable and measurable.
Yes.
And short term as well, which really brings such a different element to psychotherapy.
Very much. Yeah, we know, for instance, that some of the work in behavior therapy is led to remarkable work around PTSD and trauma intervention. So trauma, obsessive compulsive disorder, actually many anxiety-related disorders. Behavior therapy is shown to have very high efficacy, as high as 80 or 90% with certain challenges or difficulties. So, wow, this is a powerhouse treatment and therapeutically wise.
It can bring so much relief, and in, like you say, with trauma work and PTSD and anxiety related difficulties, it really makes a massive difference to it.
Yes.
And I think with behavior therapy, there's been various developments, and we'll get to them. But one of the original ones is the classical conditioning. And with that, we really started to understand human behavior and how anxiety also develops.
Yes. Yeah, that is key. What a cornerstone in the developments. And how about we take a look at that?
Sounds good, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So if we look at that, really the key contribution here in the development is with Pavlov, who's really, really well known, Ivan Pavlov, and a Russian physiologist. And he had done some remarkable work around digestion with dogs. And his findings and his discovery, which was an incredible breakthrough, was really incidental because he was studying digestion. It wasn't supposed to be a huge contribution, a breakthrough in understanding behavior and human behavior. And in effect, he was looking at the digestion of dogs and looking specifically at salivation. And he recognized, or came to just observe, that with the lab assistant, as the lab assistant was effectively bringing the food for the dogs, they would begin to salivate just in anticipation, even before any food was presented, just seeing the lab assistant, hearing the footsteps, and already there was an increase in salivation. He had all sorts of very fancy ways of measuring the salivation of the dogs, but it was done scientifically with tubes and tubules in their mouths to measure the salivation. But the key thing is that it was recognized, and he began to study this. How come the dogs were now able to, or salivating in advance? And what he then discovered through experimentation is that dogs will naturally, when there's food, salivate. But if that is paired with something neutral, like a bell is neutral for a dog, and if that bell is paired each time with the food repeatedly, at some point, the bell on its own, without the food, will now result in the salivation response, the drooling. And this was incredible because effectively drooling or salivation is not a learnt response in dogs. It just happens. And now the dogs were actually salivating there was a learning process. They had actually learned to salivate in relationship to something totally new. And that's quite remarkable.
Psychotherapy is not only a profession, it's a state of being. And for that, it requires continuous learning, training, and refining your skills. If you would like to become better in your role as a psychotherapist, come and join Dr. Warwick Phipps for in-person training at Treatment Work Centre, where you will experience training like never before from a thought leader and expert in psychotherapy. If you would like some more information on our training or to book a training session, please visit the link in the description. And also, if you find these podcast episodes meaningful, please subscribe to The Art of Therapy. There's no direct link between the bowel and the salivation, which just shows the capability of learning and actually forming those links.
Yes, that's it. Because there's no special association there, no special, but through the repeated pairing, something occurs, learning occurs. And so this actually opened up. It was one of the keys to understanding learning, that it's through repeated association. And that is affecting us in profound ways, because a lot of his later research, he went on to do a number of lectures on conditioned reflexes. And what became apparent and through his life's work is that many of our emotions are actually because of or function of this learning process by association. And so we actually learn, we acquire fears, we acquire anxiety. But just as we learn these and can develop these associations that we can wire for it, we can rewire. And classical conditioning actually shows us how we can begin to do it, and quite predictably.
It's actually remarkable that he really, this was a coincidence of actually coming to this conclusion and understanding it.
Yes.
And really showing the potential of learning. And like you say, it's human beings, we learn through association, and we might not even remember it.
Yes.
But we learn through that. And with that, this anxiety is not just there, but it's actually through learning through different experiences.
Yeah, this is so important what you said, because part of it was that you just noted it's not even in our awareness. We're so used to thinking that everything is conscious, but there's a great deal of the way we behave, our habits, our responses, that really just occur automatically, unconsciously, as it were. And if we go back to Pavlov with his dogs, those dogs weren't consciously learning. It was just happening. It was automatic. And yet the learning was profound. They were now salivating in response to a bell.
Yes.
So, yes, much of this then happens outside of our awareness. But it also explains why so much of our behavior at times can limit us. We can get stuck in fear cycles, extreme anxiety, phobic responses, where we know that our reaction is not rational, but something just overtakes us, this dread, procrastination. There's so much of our functioning day to day that is, we register a difficulty, but very often we're not clear on why or in what way, because much of our learning is happening rapidly and outside of conscious awareness through a process of learning association.
Yes. And I think that's just what you mentioned is it's an unconscious process. A lot of the times it's outside of our awareness.
Yes.
But just because it's outside of awareness, we're still learning.
Yes.
And which means if we are learning, it means that we can relearn, or we can retrain.
Yes.
And that's where the power is at. It's actually understanding that human beings can learn through our behavior and through associations.
Yes. This was, I really think, one of the main developments, just as you've explained, that you can relearn, rewire. Because with Pavlov, once it was clear that many fears are actually learned, conditioned. This would really need to be tested. And that's where, if we just move ahead to John B. Watson. Now, he did some very, very interesting work. He was very strong in his thinking. He came up with the Behaviourist Manifesto, I think, and he really was very passionate, and he did some important work in building on Pavlov to take it further. If our fears are conditioned or learned, if that's true, can we actually induce a fear deliberately? And that's where part of his work in 1920 with little Albert, it was quite controversial at the time and in subsequent years, because in effect he trained a little boy, a 9-year-old or 9-month-old, who had no fear of rats, but who then developed a fear of a rat, a white rat, through the process of classical conditioning. So what would happen is, in the presence of the rat, and the child really there was no fear initially, and there would be a loud noise on metal struck right next to the boy's ear, and that would of course induce fright. And this was done several times, and then of course what would happen is later there was no noise, but as soon as the little boy would see or have contact with a white rat, there would be extreme fear. And later the boy began to generalize the fear to all furry things and white furry things. So it would generalize to a coat, a furry coat, and then even to something like a Father Christmas beard, white Father Christmas beard. So it was controversial because the actual study induced distress, and there's been huge changes in the way we approach things today. But in effect, what was learned there is that fears and phobias, in this case of a white rat, can be induced, and that once there's a fear, it starts to generalize. And so it gets bigger, it expands to other things or other areas. So it showed us exactly how phobias work.
It's actually amazing. Like you say, it is controversial of how the experiment was done, but there was so much learning from it, because through that we actually learned that how phobias, how fears are established.
Yes.
And again, like we know, fears and phobias, they're not rational.
Yes.
They don't make logical sense.
Yes.
It's like being scared of if a child is just scared of dogs. But it's a very friendly dog and it wags its tail, but this child experienced such high distress just with seeing this dog. So if we understand that there might have been an association earlier on, and that the child generalized that to all dogs, then we can start to understand and actually have more understanding, more empathy for this child.
Very much, because once you understand that process and what's happening and how quickly and powerfully there can be a fear response, which seems so irrational or counterintuitive to parents, caregivers. But the moment one can see that as a therapist, one can have very high empathy and, moreover, know how to begin helping this child or help them overcome their fear.
The classical conditioning, it created so much understanding of how people experience anxiety, how they experience fears, and how these develop then. And like you say, as soon as we can understand how they develop, then there's power in helping someone to change that with different associations.
Very much. And that's really what was then added to in terms of this next development, was understanding that we can not only induce fears, phobias, very, very in a known way, but we can actually relieve them, and we can do so really predictably. But perhaps we just pause here for the moment, and this is something that we explore in our next episode.
That sounds good. I think there's so many developments in behavior therapy that, but let's pause here, and then we can just further explore this in the next episode.
Yes, I look forward to that.
Me too. Thank you for joining us on The Art of Therapy. If you found this episode meaningful, or if it expanded your knowledge, we would love to hear from you in the comment section. We are looking forward to continuing this journey with you. Until our next episode.